you made it very clear that you had deep reservations about authorizing the president to invade Iraq. And you stated those publicly, and the Democrats were trying to find a position. There was a lot of disagreement inside the Democratic Party in both houses. And your counterpart, Minority Leader Gephardt in the House, wound up making a deal with the president, at least from his point of view, to support the president in seeking this authorization to go to war in Iraq. Did you feel that you didn't have any moves left at that point, that you had to go along? And if you did feel that way, why?
Well, you're right, Linda. Our caucus was divided literally right down the middle. We had half in favor, reluctantly, and half in opposition. And so it started with that, this notion that however we go, we're not going to unify our caucus. There was a great deal of skepticism by then about Bush and what he had in mind. He appeared to want to fight rather than talk, and many of our caucus members negotiated various scenarios requiring that we go to the UN and requiring that we build a greater alliance with other allies before we did anything. And we, for the most part, were able to get some of this nominally incorporated into the agreement. Dick Gephardt was a little more forward-leaning on all of that, and that was a factor. I mean, we had to make some decisions about where this country was going to go. They told us that they had weapons of mass destruction. They were going to use them against the United States. This was 1 year after the 9/11 attack, and so who were we to challenge the entire intelligence community who said this is the fact. These are the circumstances. You've got to understand the critical nature of taking Iraq out before they come after us. So based on incredibly faulty intelligence and the assertions of this administration, and over the reluctance and skepticism of many of my colleagues, reluctantly I concluded that it was probably better to give the benefit of the doubt to the administration and move forward with this resolution. It's one of my biggest regrets and biggest mistakes in public life.
Were you upset with Dick Gephardt, who I know is your friend, for siding with the president and not leaving you many options?
Well, we all have to do what we have to do, and I'm sure there were times when I did things that didn't comply with his expectations. It was not what I wanted, but it was what we had to do, and I don't fault him at all. I don't question his judgment. He had a little different take than I did, but by and large, he's a very close friend, and I'm willing to accept, the fact that leaders have to make choices and decisions. He made one that I wasn't entirely in compliance with, but it was one I respected nonetheless.
What role did election eve pressures play upon some Democrats who decided against what were clearly their own idea of what was their better judgment? What role did election year pressures play?
Linda, that's a hard question to answer because I would never use any specifics here, but I think it played very consequentially. I don't think there's any doubt that that election eve political pressures were perhaps the final factor for many people as they made their decisions about how to vote on this. I was worried about that. There was a conversation at one of these breakfasts, I can recall, talking to the president saying, look, your father had to make a similar choice, and your father moved that choice beyond the election. We didn't vote on the first Iraqi resolution until after the election. We were in a lame duck session. I said, I implore you to do the same thing. He looked at the vice president, and there was some eye contact, and then he looked at me and he said, we can't do that. So they wanted to apply the maximum degree of political pressure to get their position and to pass it, and that's what they did.
You have been very forthcoming in talking about how much you regret your own vote because, again, you stated all kinds of objections and raised some scenarios which came true. Turned out Iraq was not particularly adept at democracy with no history. You raised the question of sectarian violence, impending sectarian violence. But do you think that, given that it was giving the president an unusual power, that is to wage preemptive war, do you think that Congress spent enough time on that issue before voting?
I don't, since we made a mistake, I guess I'd have to say no. But, it wasn't for lack of debate. I mean, we had spent a good deal of time over a period of time talking about this and trying to figure out how to do it. My preference, again, would have been to wait until after the election so that there was no political pressure. Everybody could have voted their conscience. They could have had the benefit of additional time to analyze intelligence data, which turned out to be so faulty. So I guess the short answer is no. But at that moment, I guess I felt we had adequate time to think about the circumstances and respond.
And then finally, there were some members. There was always an anti-war group inside the Democratic caucus. And as I recall, Senators Kennedy and Byrd pushed for a second vote, another vote, before actually going to war. Why did you leaders decide that might not be the best course, to have a second vote at this point with troops amassing?
Well, our feeling was at that point that we were going to lose that vote by a large margin. And I felt that it would be seen as a sign of weakness on the first vote. We were trying to make a statement here that all these conditions and all of these things that we had negotiated, as good as they sounded, needed to have the weight that we were trying to imply as we talked about them, and to concede that another vote was necessary diminished to a certain extent all these things that we had tried to put in the first series of requirements of the administration. So that was really it. It was sending a mixed message that I thought complicated our situation even more. That was a tactical question, and I can see where people would disagree, but that was how we interpreted it, and I think the leaders were fairly united in that interpretation.
Let's talk a little bit about partisanship in the Senate, which, as in the House, has been steadily on the rise, certainly since you were there. This is a very broad question, but what are the factors in your tenure that you think were the high points? I mean, certainly when I want to talk about President Bush and these last few years, there was impeachment, there was the Republican Revolution. Many things happened. The media's changed. What do you think sort of has led to what some say is even a dysfunctional level of partisanship?
Well, you start with personalities, because I think it's the personalities involved that create a large part of the environment. The leaders have a profound influence on how all this plays out, and Newt Gingrich was a very, very partisan leader. Tom DeLay is a very partisan leader. And I think that the combination of personalities, and there's a notion when you've been subject to abuse, that payback is really part of the process, and there's a tremendous amount of sense of payback that we were under their thumb for 40 years, and by God, we're going to do the same thing, but it's even going to be tougher. We're going to even, I call it majorityism. Majorityism is when the majority decides that it's only the majority that's required to do anything, and there's a real sense of majorityism in the Congress today. But that's the immediate. If I could put my finger on one thing, it would be the airplane. The airplane has destroyed, to a certain extent, what environment we had up until the 1950s. And I say that because airplanes have made things all too easy now for for members to leave. They leave on Thursdays, they come back on Tuesdays. We really only have about a day and a half each week to work together. And that day and a half is exacerbated by all the pressures members feel when they come back. So they just aren't here like they used to be. And when they were here, they created the social fabric that allowed for real communication and dialogue. I mean, the poker games and the shots of whiskey at the end of the day, and just the camaraderie that came with outings and getting to know each other. And, you know, that's all almost lost today. Most members don't know the families of the members that they work with. They don't know much about their past. Senator Reid, right now, the current leader, is actually going through something that I never thought of doing, but I think is a good idea. He is actually having each member introduce themselves to the caucus and talk about their personal lives and who they are and things that their caucus members may not know anything about. And, you know, it's a reflection on how little we know each other. It's why I always felt Codels were such a good thing, because you developed bonds and relationships that you otherwise just never had the opportunity to get before. So the airplane. The second is your business, the media. You know, when so much of what dialogue occurs now occurs through the media instead of privately. You walk to the media, you make a proclamation, and the other side is going to respond. And so much of the debate goes on between members and especially among leaders through the media instead of privately, and that's unfortunate. I think there's also a much more sensationalism today than there should be, and you know, media loves a good fight, and so reporting on good fights and stupid things that happen get compounded and probably magnified. And then, of course, money. Money drives so much of this, and I think that's a big problem for us today. The money hunt is just obscene. And then finally, just a physical lack of appreciation of the institutions. I say physical lack because it's not just a lack of appreciation from an historical point of view or from just this patriotic point of view, but we've actually seen a degradation in the facilities themselves as a result of deep cuts in maintenance and the budgets for the Capitol. So all that comes together to create a totally different environment than we had 50 years ago.